4 decades, Meryl Streep and Don Gummer were believed to be one of the last unshakable love stories in Hollywood. A marriage untouched by scandal, fame, or time. But behind the quiet dignity of their relationship, a single turning point shattered everything she thought she could hold together. Something happened that forced Meryl to make the most painful decision of her life, ending a 45-year partnership that once defined her sense of home. The truth is far heavier than what headlines ever captured, and the real story reveals a side of Meryl Streep few have ever seen. The day everything quietly changed. Meryl Streep and Don Gummer had spent nearly half a century navigating the unpredictable tides of Hollywood while fiercely protecting the sanctity of their marriage. They raised 4 children, built parallel careers, hers in front of the world, his in quiet artistic spaces, and held together through challenges that would have broken many others. Yet somewhere around 2017, a private shift began, one subtle enough that even close friends did not fully understand it at first. This wasn't a dramatic explosion or a public rupture. It was quiet, slow, and deeply personal. By the time the world saw them together at the 2018 Academy Awards, the truth was already set in motion. The romantic core of their marriage had ended, but they kept the decision entirely to themselves. For more than 6 years, they lived separate emotional lives, even while sharing children, grandchildren, and decades of memories. The shocking part was that Meryl continued to wear her wedding ring, a symbol she refused to remove even during official events, interviews, and red carpets. In October 2023, she was photographed at the Princess of Asturias Awards in Spain, her ring still in place, leading fans and reporters to assume nothing had changed, but everything had. When People magazine finally confirmed the separation in late 2023, the public was stunned. But the statement revealed something even more unexpected. The split had occurred years earlier, long before anyone realized. According to her representative, Don Gummer and Meryl Streep have been separated for more than 6 years. And while they will always care for each other, they have chosen lives apart. The timeline placed their separation quietly around the time they sold their longtime Tribeca penthouse in 2020. And when Meryl moved into a mid-century Pasadena home she purchased in 2017. What triggered the moment Meryl finally accepted the end of her marriage wasn't a scandal or betrayal. It was the realization that the emotional distance had become irreversible. Something inside her shifted, and once it shifted there was no turning back. A marriage built on privacy, balance, and silent sacrifice. To understand the depth of what was lost, one must look back at how Meryl Streep and Don Gummer built one of the most enduring partnerships Hollywood had ever seen. They met in 1978 under heartbreaking circumstances. Meryl was grieving the death of John Cazale, the love she thought she would spend her life with, who had just passed away from lung cancer. Don Gummer entered her world not as a replacement, but as a steady presence, someone who offered stability, compassion, and the gentleness she desperately needed during a time when her life felt uprooted. They married just 6 months after meeting, and for decades their bond seemed unbreakable. Unlike many celebrity couples who struggled under constant public examination, Meryl and Don constructed a life defined by quietness. She was the face recognized everywhere, collecting Oscars, delivering historic performances shaping the landscape of American cinema. He was the sculptor, the quiet architect whose metal and stone installations appeared in galleries from the early 1970s onward. While she stood under blinding lights and global scrutiny, he worked in shadows, content with a life built on craftsmanship, solitude, and discipline. But this balance wasn't effortless. Meryl often spoke about the emotional demands of raising 4 children while sustaining a full-time acting career. In a 2002 Vogue interview, she described marriage as an enormous negotiation, one that required goodwill, compromise, and knowing when to remain silent. "I have a holistic need to work and to have huge ties of love in my life," she said, revealing how she felt torn between 2 worlds, both essential to her identity. Motherhood pushed her to physical and emotional limits. Her oldest daughter, Mamie, was born in 1983, Grace followed in 1986, Louisa in 1991, and her son Henry in 1979. Between pregnancies, filming schedules, and Don's evolving art career, the marriage required constant recalibration. Meryl often admitted that being a mother was harder than acting. Acting brought applause, but motherhood brought relentless uncertainty. Still, the marriage endured because they created boundaries that protected them. They rarely gave interviews about their relationship, rarely attended Hollywood events as a couple, and kept their private life insulated from media narratives. For decades, this strategy worked flawlessly. But the same wall that protected them for years eventually became the barrier that trapped them. 2 people living parallel lives, drifting further apart without the world noticing. The slow drift, when two lives quietly separate. For most marriages, separation arrives like a storm, loud, chaotic, and impossible to ignore. But for Meryl Streep and Don Gummer, the unraveling came as a whisper. There was no explosive argument, no tabloids circling their home, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, the shift began as a subtle distance, something intangible but undeniable, growing slowly over the years until it became too large to overlook. Around 2017, the first signs emerged quietly. Meryl purchased a mid-century home in Pasadena, thousands of miles from the East Coast life she had shared with Don since the late 1970s. As filming schedules took her across the country, and Don remained rooted in his artistic routines, physical distance slowly became emotional distance. They were no longer moving in tandem. They were moving in parallel. 3 years later in early 2020, they sold their beloved 3,950 square feet Tribeca penthouse for $15.8 million after 14 years of ownership. The sale was steeply discounted after months on the market. But what mattered wasn't the price. It was the symbolism. The penthouse had been their shared base, the place they returned to between projects, pregnancies, exhibitions, and milestones. Letting it go felt like the closing of a chapter neither of them could fully articulate at the time. And yet, through all of this, Meryl continued wearing her wedding band. At the September 2023 Princess of Asturias Awards in Spain, she walked the ceremony with her ring still visible, fueling public speculation that her marriage remained intact. Fans saw the ring as a sign of devotion. Insiders saw something else. The ring was not about the present. It was about honoring nearly half a century of history. The truth was far more complicated. According to the official confirmation released in October 2023, Meryl and Don had already been separated for over 6 years by the time the world discovered it. They still cared deeply about each other, but they had chosen lives apart, a phrase that gently acknowledged what they had already accepted privately. Their separation was not the collapse of a marriage, but the quiet acceptance that the emotional landscape had shifted beyond repair. They weren't angry. They weren't resentful. They were simply two people who had given everything they could and finally recognized they had reached the limits of what love could sustain. But the real turning point, the moment that changed everything for Meryl, had roots deeper than anyone realized. To understand it, you must go back to the most painful chapter of her early life. One that never fully released its hold on her. The shadow of John Cazale, a love that never fully let go. To understand the emotional weight behind Meryl Streep's final decision, one must return to 1978, long before Oscars, long before global fame, long before Don Gummer entered her life. That year, Meryl experienced a loss so profound that it shaped every relationship that followed. John Cazale, her partner and the man she deeply loved, died of lung cancer at just 42 years old. He was already a legend, appearing in The Godfather, Dog Day Afternoon, and The Deer Hunter. But to Meryl, he was more than a colleague or a partner. He was a soulmate, a guiding presence, a grounding force. His illness came swiftly. His death came even faster. And Meryl at 29 found herself grieving publicly while trying to survive privately. She once described that period as a moment when the floor fell out from under her life. In interviews over the decades, she always spoke of John with a mixture of reverence and sorrow, revealing how deeply he influenced her, not just as an actress, but as a human being. Just weeks after John's passing, Meryl moved out of the apartment they had shared. Don Gummer, a friend of her brother's, offered her a place to stay while she rebuilt her life. What began as emotional refuge slowly grew into companionship. 6 months later, they were married. It was a leap of faith, a step toward healing, but not a step that erased her past. People often assume grief fades. Meryl knew better. Grief changes form, but it never truly disappears. 4 years, she carried John with her, a quiet part of her emotional landscape, a memory that shaped her understanding of love, loyalty, and loss. Even during her happiest moments with Don, that early wound remained somewhere within her. This lingering emotional imprint didn't diminish her love for Don, nor did it undermine their commitment. But it became a permanent piece of her inner world. A piece that influenced how she connected, how she loved, and how she navigated emotional distance later in life. As she and Don began drifting apart, the unresolved echoes of her past resurfaced in ways she had never expected. The truth was simple, yet painful. She had experienced devastating loss once before, and she recognized the feeling when it returned. This time it wasn't death taking someone away. It was time, change, and the quiet erosion of emotional closeness. And when that moment of recognition hit her, she knew something had to change. The pressure of fame, time, and two diverging lives. Even in the strongest marriages, time applies pressure. But in a marriage where one partner becomes one of the most recognizable faces on earth and the other chooses a life of quiet artistry, that pressure intensifies in ways few can imagine. Meryl Streep's rise to global superstardom didn't happen overnight. It unfolded across decades, from Kramer vs. Kramer to The Iron Lady to Mamma Mia and beyond. Every award season, every film set, every interview, and every expectation pulled her deeper into a public life that never seemed to stop expanding. Meanwhile, Don Gummer's world remained grounded, predictable, intimate. His sculptures appeared in galleries from Boston to Los Angeles, but he never chased spotlight or fame. He thrived in silence, in routine, in creation. Their difference, once a source of balance, slowly became a difference in tempo. Meryl moved at the speed of Hollywood. Don moved at the speed of art. For years, they worked hard to maintain that balance. Meryl often acknowledged that marriage required compromise, flexibility, and an ability to quiet one's ego. In interviews, she spoke openly about motherhood being harder than acting, about juggling red carpets with parent-teacher meetings, about the complicated negotiations that come with raising 4 children while honoring each other's careers. She meant every word. But something changed as the years passed. Hollywood demanded more of her. Not just her time, but her emotional energy. Public appearances, global interviews, international sets, and constant scrutiny created a rhythm that didn't match Don's quieter life. The deeper she went into the world of fame, the more isolated he became from it. They weren't fighting. They weren't angry. They were simply growing in different directions. There is a particular loneliness that comes when two people still admire each other, but no longer share the same rhythm. And that loneliness became unavoidable by the late 2010s. They weren't arguing. They were drifting. They weren't breaking apart. They were slowly living separate emotional lives. Selling the Tribeca penthouse in 2020 symbolized the end of their shared home base. And Meryl's new Pasadena residence reflected a deeper truth. They were no longer building their life in the same place, emotionally or literally. The realization didn't come in an explosion. It came quietly one day when Meryl understood that they had both changed and the marriage had changed with them. But the moment she knew she had to let go came only when she recognized that holding on would have caused more hurt than acceptance ever could. Acceptance, separation, and the quiet ending of a 45-year love story. When Meryl Streep finally accepted that her marriage had reached its natural end point, there was no dramatic confrontation, no emotional explosion, no bitter public fallout. What happened instead was far more heartbreaking, a moment of clarity. She realized that she and Don Gummer were no longer sharing the same emotional life, and that holding on out of habit, history, or fear would only erode the respect that had carried them through nearly half a century together. Their decision to separate was made privately, with the same dignity that had defined their partnership from the very beginning. There were no lawyers leaking information, no insider whispering to tabloids, no angry statements. Instead, Meryl and Don quietly chose to live apart more than 6 years before the world ever heard the news. They kept birthdays, grandchildren, and family events separate but connected, always prioritizing their children over public curiosity. Even after the split, Meryl continued wearing her wedding ring at public events, not as a symbol of denial, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the life they had built together. The ring represented 4 children, 5 grandchildren, decades of supporting each other's dreams, and a love that had outlasted the relentless demands of fame. When she walked the stage at the 2023 Princess of Asturias Awards in Spain, with the ring still on her finger, fans saw stability. In reality, what they saw was respect. The official confirmation finally came in October 2023 through a statement to People. It was simple, clear, and deeply human. Don Gummer and Meryl Streep have been separated for more than 6 years, and while they will always care for each other, they have chosen lives apart. There was no scandal, no betrayal, no anger. Just 2 people who had given each other 45 years of partnership and reached a point where their lives were moving in different directions. Meryl continues her extraordinary career, most recently shining in Only Murders in the Building. While Don remains devoted to his life as a sculptor, quiet, private, and purposeful, their paths have diverged, but the affection, history, and gratitude remain intact. In the end, the heartbreaking truth is this. Their marriage did not end because something went wrong. It ended because life changed. And they chose to honor that change with grace instead of resistance. What do you think about Meryl and Don's quiet, respectful separation after 45 years together? Do you believe some relationships simply evolve over time? If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like the video, leave your thoughts below, and subscribe for more stories about Hollywood's most fascinating lives.